Hi, thank you for joining me today on YouTube, where I'm talking about how emotions drive our behavior in the workplace, how our emotions really impact so much of what's going on, and yet we don't talk about and we don't acknowledge emotions often in the workplace. So thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoy the content. And if you do, please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you have any questions, do get in touch via LinkedIn messaging or by email. Thank you. Here we go. So you're all very welcome. Thanks a million for joining me today. And yeah, hopefully you find it helpful. Um, so I think anybody who's with me live today already knows who I am, Neve Hannon. But what we're focusing on today are emotions in the workplace and how they drive our behavior. And typically, emotions are ignored or pushed under the carpet or, not supposed to happen at all in the workplace. And that's a bit of a myth because we're human beings and we are emotional creatures. And those emotions, in fact, drive a lot of our behavior. So they impact us. How we're feeling impacts how we act, how we behave, how we react to others, how we deal with what's going on around. So if you're supporting somebody as a coach or you're a leader, a manager, for example, then you kind of want to better understand emotions. And I think this is getting even more important as AI starts to take over the world. Um, Emotions really are what you make us uniquely human. So it becomes all the more important for us to understand our emotions and learn how to work with them instead of working against them, as what often happens. Um, so yeah, so that's our plan for today. Um, a little bit about my background. I'm a chartered counselling psychologist. I was a therapist for 20 years here in Ireland, in South Dublin. I worked a lot with adults, but I also worked a lot with teenagers, adolescents. And in 2019, I closed down my private practice. I had been counselling for 20 years at that point, and that was enough. So I no longer offer any therapy. Um, since then, I retrained in coaching and I offer coaching. I work a lot with senior leaders, so it's really executive and leadership coaching. Um, and then beside that, my and what I'm talking to about today is EMC, emotional connection. So I'm the first to bring this approach to Europe. And so that's why I'm really happy to run these webinars and delighted to have you here with me because I want to let people know that this exists. So I'll hopefully all of that will make a lot more sense for you. And if you'd like to hear more, and just get in touch afterwards. So, what is EMC, emotional connection? Well, really, it's a whole approach that allows organizations to master the art of relationships. Um, we want to support people to I suppose, deal with things as they arise and help their leaders to be more emotionally attuned so that you can prevent conflict happening and all the fallout that happens from conflict. So that really, teams can work to a high performance level because they're sharing a common language and understanding. What I love about this approach, many things, but one of the key pieces here is that there's no bad guy, there's no finger pointing or scapegoating. Really, it's about what happens in the space between two people. So even if there is conflict, it's not about, they're the problem. If only you could get rid of them, then, we'd have an amazing team, which is what typically happens. And that person is often managed out only to find that there's still difficulties in the team. So this approach gives you a roadmap. It's like a language for the team to learn, so that they are speaking the same language, singing off the same hymn sheet, know how to deal with the challenges that arise inevitably in relationships, and can build stronger bonds so that they can feel safe in their workplace, psychological safety, and repair those relationships even after conflict so that they can perform. So this is developed and researched by US psychologist Dr. Lola Gershfeld and her team. She's been working on this in the States for the last 15 years. She has written several books on the topic. and done a huge amount of work with a large amount of companies. So there's lots of case studies, lots of resources, and I'll share their website at the end. So, emotional connection, EMC, as I mentioned, it's a newly evolving, very structured approach to team relationships, and it's based on the science of attachment. So, I'll explain that in a moment. And essentially, when people work together, their dependency, it turns on bonding needs. So, one of the key things here is that we grossly underestimate in work how much of an impact we have on other people and how much other people impact us. They impact on us physiologically, for example, our heart rate, our breathing rate, but they also impact on us emotionally, the impact on our well-being, the impact on our mood, the impact on our work ability. So our attachment theory really explains that and helps us to make sense of that. And emotional connection is the glue that holds that bond together really in the workplace. So just to explain and just welcome everybody just who arrived in there in the last few minutes, just to explain attachment theory, because emotional connection is very much based on attachment theory. And attachment theory was developed in the 1950s and 60s by John Bowlby and then by Marie Ainsworth and lots of other researchers. And really it's about the fact that I suppose what was observed first of all is that when a baby comes into the world, they're totally dependent on their caregivers, particularly the primary caregivers, and certainly in the 50s and 60s that was mostly the mother. um, and and the relationship and how that relationship is formed is a template for future relationships. So we form an attachment bond in order to survive. And we learn about the world through that primary attachment bond. So if mum or primary caregiver is responsive when we cry, if our nappy is changed when we're wet, if we're fed when we're hungry, then we learn that the world is a safe place and that our needs will be met and that we can trust. But if for any reason mum or primary caregiver are unavailable, unresponsive, then we learn to expect something different of the world. We may be untrusting, we may be suspicious, we may feel rejected or abandoned, we might feel like we're on our own, that it's not a safe place, and that impacts on our sense of safety in the world, and that's supposed to act as a template right through. So we know that secure attachment and that secure connection calms down our nervous system, and distress then becomes more manageable. So when we cry, we're soothed, and if we learn that, then we learn how to soothe ourselves over time. But in fact, soothing ourselves happens best when we're with a safe other. So all of this makes sense in attachment theory. And so just one second while I just adjust the screen here. So we can be more emotionally balanced when there's a secure attachment. Now, for EMC, we don't go into whether you're securely attached or insecurely attached, or your different types of insecure attachment across your lifespan. What we look at is what's happening in the workplace, and we look at it through the attachment lens. So believe it or not, when those relationships that we form in the workplace with our manager in particular, whoever we report into, but also our close colleagues, we depend on those people in order to be able to do our work. And so they are attachment bonds. And when we feel secure in those bonds, we can bring ourselves to work. We feel psychologically safe, we feel emotionally safe, we can perform at our best. But when something goes wrong in those relationships, that triggers us. It creates an emotional reaction. So that's the importance of the relationship. So just to give you some data on that even, we know, and you can see here that job satisfaction gives us contributes to about 25% of our life satisfaction. Okay, so there are other factors in life that are more important than our job, including our mental health. That's a much bigger contributor to life satisfaction. But if we look at that 25% that's down to job satisfaction and we open that up, drivers of our job satisfaction, the biggest factor is our interpersonal relationships. Now, we know that to be true ourselves. If you think back through jobs, it doesn't matter how interesting the job, that's not as important a factor, or even how well you get paid. If you don't get on well with the people that you're working with, you won't stay. Whereas even if you're in a crappy job that's going nowhere, but you really like the people that you work with and you have good relationships there, you might stay a lifetime in that job. So our interpersonal relationships are massively important. And when we look at that 39% and break that down, 86% of that is down to the relationships that we have with management. So the manager direct report relationship is a critical driver of satisfaction in our interpersonal relationships at work and into our whole satisfaction on the job, really. So that those relationships are really, really important. And I rarely hear people talking about the importance of our work relationships because we just totally underestimate it. We think it's about all these other variables, but actually, when we come down to it, it's, people leave the job often because they're not getting on with their boss. So some of the research would show, and this is from the CPP Global Human Capital Report 2022, their research in 2008 showed that the average employee is spending 3 hours per week dealing with conflicts. Okay. That has only increased over time. In 2022, that was measured to be 4.2 hours. So in the average workplace, say if you've got 10 people on your team, that's 10 people, each wasting 4.2 hours per week dealing with conflict. Now, for 10 people, that's 42 hours a week. That's spread out over the year. That's a full-time salary. That's how much that's costing. If you've got a big organization where you have thousands, how much is that wasting? And that's looking maybe at the hour cost. So I work, as I mentioned, a lot with senior leaders for coaching. One of the big things that they bring to one-to-one coaching is, how the stress and the energy that is going on a difficult relationship in the workplace for them. It just causes them so much sleepless nights. They're trying to handle it. They don't know how. They're trying to be sensitive. And we just don't have the skills usually to deal with that. And so that's why people are bringing it to coaching, and they're losing sleep over it and they're stressing out over it. And yet we still don't really click that, workplace relationships really matter. They are really important. So Harvard Business Review, this is 2018, but you've probably heard like this stat has been shown across lots of different data sources. About 75% would say that the most stressful aspect of their job is their relationship with their immediate boss. And about 75% of people who leave a job will say that it's because of that difficult relationship with their boss. So if you are a leader, then the engagement and retention of your team is hugely down to the relationships that you have with each of those members of your team. So the root cause of difficult behavior in the workplace is a breakdown in that connection between colleagues or direct report and manager. It's a disconnect. That's what's happening. So when you're seeing bad behavior, if you're seeing somebody acting out, if you're seeing, different things going on, low performance, one of the things that people rarely look at, and actually that I'm impressing on you that you need to really look at, is where is the disconnect happening? Because there is one. And the most obvious answer is between the worker and the person they report into. We're socially bonding creatures. We're we're wired to connect. Okay. We need that connection in order to survive and thrive. And there's a lot of neuroscience behind that. So, recent neuroscience research has highlighted the consequences of isolation and the loss of social connection. So, if we go back to the times when we lived in tribes, if you were excluded or rejected from your tribe, that meant certain death for you. We couldn't survive alone. We needed our tribe. And we've got a massive population, there's people everywhere. And yet, the same the same is real for us today. When we feel excluded, if there's a threat of rejection or abandonment, and we don't use those words, but that's what's being triggered in us is that fear, because that's as close to death for us as it can get. And so we know in our world that loneliness and isolation are at pretty much epidemic levels. We're feeling disconnected. Engagement is very low across globally in the workplace. Again, people are feeling disconnected, and that leads to disengagement. It leads to stress. It leads to uh, poor behavior, but also lower well-being for people. We cannot thrive at home or at work in life if we're feeling disconnected. So I wanted to bring in emotions to this today. That something we don't speak about that often. And I like this little kind of model. I'm sure you've seen the iceberg used for lots of different explanations, but it works for this as well. In the workplace, usually the kind of emotions that you see are the ones happening above the surface. And when they're negative, we often have a reaction to those emotions. So, we can see and observe frustration, annoyance, irritation, impatience, resentment, disappointment, betrayal, or that kind of frozen response. We can recognize those emotions happening in somebody else. We read them, in fractions of a second, and we're often triggered by them. So if somebody is feeling those emotions, they're going to be expressing them in some kind of way, usually either on their face, which takes us like fractions of a millisecond literally to register, um, or in the tone of their voice or their behavior. Depending how much of a lid they're trying to keep in it. So the surface emotion layer is the stuff that we see happening. And usually that stuff triggers us, and then we're reacting. And now we're experiencing some of these negative emotions, and that's re triggering the other person because that's what they're seeing. So all of these surface emotions are floating around, and we're having reactions to those. Today, I'd like to bring you a little bit deeper because under the surface, there are more vulnerable emotions happening, the softer emotions. So they're what we're experiencing inside, but because they're vulnerable, we don't like to show them on the outside. And very often, we're not even aware of them unless we're quite tuned into our emotions. Uh, Very often people will just know, I feel annoyed, you're driving me mad. Um, but they won't necessarily know or understand that I'm panicking inside because of the threat of disconnection. And you're my boss, and this is a really important relationship to me. I don't feel safe. I feel disconnected. So we're often, a little bit removed from what's going on inside. How many people do you know that can join all those dots and make sense of their emotions when we're flooded with them? So some of those emotions happening below the surface include kind of worry, panic, that sense of being isolated or being rejected or abandoned, dismissed, overwhelmed, really common one, hopeless. And then right down the tip, driving the whole thing here, you've got the primary emotions. And the four key ones that we work with are fear, sadness, shame, and surprise. Okay, so hope this is making some sense to you. So just let me explain a little bit about what happens in the brain when we are feeling some of those surface emotions. So say, for example, you walk into your, sorry, I'm just checking. um, One second. Yeah, excuse me. So say, for example, you walk into the office of your manager or your boss, and they kind of look up at you and they have this expression on their face, and you get this feeling straight away like they don't want you there. Um, they're not interested in what you have to say. You feel a little bit dismissed. Okay. Your brain is going to have a reaction. Your brain is going to pick up on that facial expression before they even open their mouth. As I've mentioned, fractions of a second. And it's causing a reaction inside here that then you may begin to feel in your body. They haven't even said anything necessarily yet. They might, then say something, and perhaps their tone then triggers you and deepens the impression that you got initially that they don't want to talk to you right now or you're being dismissed. Now, your boss could have just come off a very stressful phone call. They could have, they could be under severe pressure, and their reaction has nothing to do with you. It is nothing personal. It's just come across in their tone because they're rushed, they're, under pressure, they're stressed, they're overwhelmed potentially themselves. But you're being triggered, and you walk out of that office feeling disconnected from your boss. They might not even realize that something has happened between the two of you because maybe they answered whatever question you had and they think, right, that's done and off you go. But you're coming out of the office and feeling like something has come between you, feeling that dismissed and maybe a little bit hurt or annoyed or a little bit miffed by how they dealt with you in there, even though maybe they answered your question. So the emotional part of the brain, the amygdala, gets fired up. And the emotional part of the brain, the amygdala, has the power to pretty much override any other part of your brain. This is really important stuff. And it can really help you to understand why, although we think of ourselves as logical, rational, reasoning creatures, we're actually emotional creatures because the emotional part of your brain can override whatever else is happening. However, your logical, rational reasoning brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, cannot override the amygdala. So it's like there's a one-way track going out. So the amygdala can send signals and override pretty much any other part of the brain, but they can't in turn override the amygdala. So what that means is that when your emotional brain is firing up, it's in the driving seat. It has control. And any amount of like rational reasoning talk to that, trying to calm your brain down, isn't going to work because the logical, rational brain is in the back seat and it's getting driven by the emotions at that moment. Okay. And the logical, rational reasoning brain doesn't have the power to kind of shove the amygdala out of the driving seat and get back in. But the amygdala can shove the rational brain out of the seat, out of the driving seat. So our emotions are very powerful. And when the amygdala is fired up, it can take over and it creates a whole sequence, a whole chain of reactions really in the body. Including, impacting our physiology, maybe our heart rate, or whether we're sweating, tightness in the stomach, all kinds of things, depending too on, how normal that is for us to have that happen. But what this means is that the prefrontal cortex, that's the last part of our brain to develop. It's in the front, and that it takes us till we're about 24 years old to be fully developed. So our teenagers don't have that. They're more impulsive. They literally they don't have that part of their brain yet. So that's the executive functioning part. So while it's very hard for us to control our emotions, it's easy for emotions to control our thoughts. Emotions can dominate the brain. Right? And this is why it's so important for us to understand emotions because they're happening in the workplace and we've got emotional brains taking over in the workplace, which means that it's much more difficult for somebody whose emotional brain is firing up to do their work. We know that and again, the research backs it up, it's much more difficult when somebody's emotional brain is firing off. It's really difficult for them to collaborate at that moment in time. They can't be creative or innovative at that moment in time. It's hard even to think straight. So it's much more difficult to perform or do your work when your emotional brain is firing off. And your emotional brain fires off when you experience a sense of disconnect. And that happens in the workplace, particularly with people that you work with closely or with your boss, very quickly. I hope that makes a little bit of sense to you. So this is just an example of some neuroscience research. Naomi Eisenberger in the University of California has shown that rejection triggers the same circuits and in the same part of the brain as physical pain. So stepping on a nail and seeing rejection in somebody's face is a danger cue for the brain. It's firing off in the same area. You might think stepping on a nail is going to be like so physically painful, but seeing rejection in somebody's face, that sense of being dismissed, that is creating the same kind of brain reaction in you as if you stepped on that nail, because it is a threat to our survival, not consciously, because of course, when the logical reasoning brain comes back in, we can reason to ourselves that maybe they didn't mean it, and of course, it's not that threatening to our survival, but that's what it feels like, and so that's how we react. Okay. So, for anybody joining with me live today, or if you're watching this on YouTube afterwards, if you have subscribed to my newsletter, you will have received an email at some point with this resource. If you don't have it, just reach out to me and I can send it to you. It's a PDF. So this is an excerpt really from the reconnection process that we use in EMC. Um, and it helps you in lots of different ways. So it's a short piece of a longer piece of the reconnection form, which is designed. It's a very structured process that is designed that when that amygdala is firing off, when we're feeling emotional, we're triggered and we're having a reaction, it helps us to start to name and become aware of what is happening in us. And going through this process calms down the amygdala. So one part of it is naming your emotions. We know, again, lots of research has shown that being able to articulate and name, and even the more specific you can get, the better, your emotions helps to reduce the intensity of those emotions. So if you have kids and you see them, having a big emotion, if you can name that emotion and give them that name, that helps them to start to regulate that emotion. The intensity of it decreases because we feel seen and we feel heard when we hit the nail on the head. If you have a child and you say, "Oh, you're mad," and you get it wrong, they'll tell you, "No, I'm not mad. I'm really sad." Um, and they'll correct you, but only if they have the language. And again, as adults, we're mad, sad, good, bad isn't enough. We have to try and articulate more succinctly what that emotion is. So I'm going to just invite you to grab a pen and paper. I'm not going to ask you to share this, but just to give you an experience of maybe working through this little exercise. Okay. So, um, yeah, sorry, just go back to that. So, first of all, I'd like you just to think of an interaction or a situation at work where you got triggered. Maybe somebody said something to you, they used a particular tone. It might have been what they said, it might have been the words they used, it might have been the tone of their voice, it might have been the look on their face. What was it? What was it that happened? Think of a time that you got triggered. If nothing is coming to example for you about something at work, you could use a home example because we're experiencing disconnections all the time. And I prefer to use the word disconnect than conflict because disconnect often comes way before conflict. So I don't know, for you, those of you listening to me here today, how many of you are in long-term relationships? So maybe you've been in a long-term relationship at some point. It doesn't matter how much you love somebody, you still experience disconnections with them. And when we're feeling disconnected from somebody, even somebody we love, or our boss or our manager, all sorts of things then trigger us about that person. Think of it at home, and whoever you're spend a lot of your life with, maybe, and if you're feeling disconnected from them, you're probably going to be irritated at all sorts of little things for the next while. Um, One thing after another, you just notice, oh, this, and how come they can't fill up the dishwasher properly, and why do they never do this, and da 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 da, and you'll have all those annoyances piling up. Why? Because you're feeling the disconnect. As soon as you can reconnect with that person and you're feeling like you're both on the same page again, those annoyances don't bother you anymore. You're not being triggered. Okay. So, for the sake of this, I'd like you just to think of an interaction or a situation where you got triggered. Again, it could be somebody's a look, it could be a tone of voice. Let me explain the three layers of emotions now while you're writing that down for yourself. First of all, we're going back here to the iceberg model. There's the surface emotions. They're the ones that are visible to us. They're easy to identify. It's usually the frustration, the irritation, the annoyance. Under the surface of the water in the iceberg model, you have the softer emotions. They're more vulnerable. They're much harder to see. People tend to guard their vulnerability, particularly in the workplace. Okay. And when we're feeling disconnected, we don't feel safe usually to be vulnerable with the other person. So we're more guarded and we're more prickly, and you see more of the surface emotions and less of the softer emotions. Okay. But here's the thing. This is the paradox, really. When we share our softer emotions, we pull people closer to us. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, even in the workplace, that gives other people permission to be vulnerable too, but it also makes us more approachable and softer, and they feel something different towards us. Whereas when we're expressing from our surface emotions, we tend to push people away. So it's not just about express your emotions. You might have heard that sometime along the line that, we need to express your emotions more. No, it's useful and healthy to express our softer emotions more, but not so useful to be expressing our surface emotions. And that's what often happens in the workplace. People are expressing their surface emotions, they're pushing people away. It creates further disconnect, really, and it's often quite triggering for people. So, Brené Brown has written a lot about vulnerability, and in the workplace, if you share from a vulnerable place, it's hard not to listen. Okay. Now, it doesn't mean that we go around feel, kind of like the crab showing the belly up, showing vulnerability all the time, because that's not safe. Some seagull's going to come along and eat that crab. Okay. It's not safe to go around being vulnerable all the time. However, it's having that ability that when it comes down to the relationship between two people, being able to take the little risk to be vulnerable, and knowing as a leader then how to attune to that and how to respond to that, in a way that actually deepens the bond. So emotions are powerful agents of change, and they're happening anyway. And often the change that's happening is negative and pushing people away. Whereas when we understand this a little bit better and we have the tools and the structure to do this in a safe way, which is what EMC offers, then suddenly, we have this power to repair whenever disconnects happen, to spot and identify that something is happening. Rather than finger pointing, it's like, okay, there's a disconnect. We're stuck in a negative cycle here, you and me. Okay, let's figure this out together. I care about you. I care about this relationship. This matters. And so you're creating that safety, and now you can go into the vulnerability. And that's a brilliant agent for change. So hopefully you've taken a moment to maybe think about a recent disconnect you've experienced where you got triggered. And now, as we go through the emotion lists I'd get you to jot down any emotions that resonate with you as you think back to the moment that you were triggered, okay, this in this disconnection experience. So on the surface, and again, this is one of the things I love. Having been a therapist for 20 years and worked with emotions for a long time, believe me, I really find this model very, very useful. Um, because most of the time, if you ask somebody, so how do you feel? Well, they feel a whole flood of emotions and they can't name them and they don't know how, or else they don't like talking about emotions and it's like pie in the sky stuff. But when you put a list in front of people in black and white, everybody I've come across is able to go down through it and go and figure it out. Okay. So it just simplifies it. So frustrated, annoyed, irritated, shut down, jot down whichever of these resonate with you from your triggering experience. Tense, disappointed, betrayed, angry, confused, alone, exhausted. Often we're feeling a whole bunch of those. And we might be ticking 10 boxes there, okay, when you're really triggered and really experiencing a disconnect with somebody who's important to you, okay? And now I'd like you to go a little bit deeper. What was happening for you under the surface? In that moment when you were triggered, like in the example I gave, when you went in and your boss looked up at you and they had that expression on their face, and then they opened their mouth and there was a particular tone of voice. What was going on for you under the surface? Was it that you felt worried, shaky, isolated, unimportant, dismissed, let down, or so on? And again, there'll often be several of those that resonate. And if it's just a momentary or a flash in the pan disconnect, we'll recover quite quickly. But if there's a series of disconnections, then you're going to have even more um, of these softer emotions, more vulnerability, and they start to cut deeper. So again, just jotting down for yourself which ones resonate with you. And they're not always emotions that we associate ourselves with feeling. Remember, it can be more difficult to tune into these because we don't like feeling vulnerable emotions. We don't like feeling vulnerable. um, so we feel, like we have to defend ourselves and protect ourselves. And we often protect ourselves so much that we don't even know that these are going on. Um, so even doing this exercise regularly, whenever you feel triggered, helps to grow your own emotional intelligence. You are tuning in to your emotions at a deeper level. You're gaining the language to be able to articulate, and that also allows you to self-regulate. And when we get better at all of that for ourselves as leaders, we've become better able to regulate the emotions of others when they're struggling. Okay. And at the very tip of the iceberg, right down at the bottom, what's driving and what's feeding into all of these emotions are your primary emotions. So the four that we use in EMC are fear, sadness, shame, and surprise. Now, there are two other primary emotions that are recognized: anger and joy. So joy is not happening when there's a disconnect. Okay, so it's not relevant to this. Anger can be a surface emotion or it can be a primary emotion. Okay. For the purposes of EMC, we see anger as a surface emotion. And again, as a therapist, I'd back that up with my own experience of having worked with, I don't know, thousands of people over 20 years. That usually when people are expressing anger, there are layers of other emotions being felt underneath, and sadness and fear are nearly always in there. Okay. So anger is usually we're just more comfortable expressing, but there's often like hurt, for example, underneath that. And then underneath that again, sadness at the disconnect or fear of abandonment. So primary emotions really get to the heart of the matter. They're part of our survival instinct. And the thing about emotions is that they're universal across cultures and they evoke similar responses. So they're easy for us to kind of recognize even in facial expressions, regardless of the culture. So I want to check in case anybody has any questions. If you do, you feel free to unmute yourself or pop them into chat. And if you're not comfortable other people seeing your message or your question, direct it to me to Neve in the chat, and I can answer it anonymously for you. So the last part of this little exercise is to describe an image of what you experienced during the disconnect. This is a part that people often find kind of difficult, and yet again, this is all part of calming down the brain, helping us to process and make sense of what is happening to us. That if you can describe an image, a visual image, so maybe like a picture. So maybe, for example, if you were feeling, if we look at the softer emotions that you're feeling, when your boss reacted in that way, and you felt disconnected, you got triggered, you may have felt like you were surrounded by people. You might have an image of being surrounded by people, but being on your own. So this kind of space between you and everybody else. Or you might have an image in your mind of you feeling really small, kind of like sitting in a corner in a darkened room. Or maybe you feel like you're just disconnected, floating off like a kite was lost its tether. It's just flying off into the sky. So that's just some examples of images that people have described when they're feeling those kind of feelings. So see for yourself if you can come up with an image to describe, what you're experiencing when during that disconnect, to reflect the emotions that you felt. What's your image for that? Okay. So just before we move on from that, that little exercise is a great way for you to tune into yourself and kind of bring those emotions down. So you're moving from the surface down into the softer emotions and processing them. So I would really encourage you to practice that every day, every time you experience a disconnect. But it's also great to use with your kids, and to kind of raise their awareness. But it's one that you can use in the workplace as well. So for those of you who are leaders or managers, again, tying this back in is the attachment question. Are you there for me? So as an employee, what I want to know is of my managers, are you there for me? Do you care? Do I matter? Do you value me? Okay. We all need to feel appreciated, need to feel valued in the workplace. When we don't feel that, we disengage. Okay. And so, one little handy, I suppose, acronym that you can think of is the A or E: accessible, responsive, and engaged. As a leader, you need to be accessible, responsive, and engaged. When that question, that attachment question comes up, are you there for me? If you're asked that question about your leader, and if you can say a resounding yes, my leader is there for me, my manager is there for me, then you have a secure relationship. But if there's a no or a maybe, sometimes, then there's an insecure relationship, and that means there's a disconnect happening. Okay. So, what does accessible, responsive, and engaged look like? It means accessible means, like, can the person reach you, or can you reach your boss? Are you open in conversations, even though you might be stressed? So if you're that leader and you're coming off the phone, can you be accessible to the person who has just walked in? Can you be responsive? Can I rely on you to respond to me when I call? Can you tune into my emotions and show that my emotions are important to you, that you care, that I matter? Okay. Um, so again, sorry, my phone is going mad here. Kid looking for lifts home from school, probably. Excuse me. So yeah, can you tune into my emotions and show that my emotions are important to you? So it's not necessarily that you have to have an emotional conversation at every turn, but you're tuning in to read between the lines, and tune into what's happening for the other person, even the tone of voice and how they come in, because it maybe they're stressed and they need you to acknowledge that. Maybe they're feeling overwhelmed. Maybe, they're just not themselves. And if you're tuned into them, you'll recognize that, you'll hear that in the tone of their voice, and you don't just ignore it, you acknowledge it. So can you engage with me or with the person, even if you don't agree with them, even if you're busy, even if you're stressed? Can you engage and be emotionally present with them? Can you slow down? And so this AORE skill for leaders really is requires us to be rather than just be in doing mode. And an awful lot of the time we're in doing mode and we're busy, 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 and it's next and it's targets and all the rest of it. This is about recognizing you have a human being in front of you. Take a few moments to slow down, connect with that human being. And then it's much easier to, once you kind of slow down and met that human being with where they're at, then there's no disconnect. You're connected, and then you can both go and do the work that and go back into the busy mode. Um, but in fact, things get done faster that way than just ignoring the fact that there's a person there and just constantly focusing on task orientation. So hopefully that's making some sense. This is a it's not a question we ask constantly, consciously, are you there for me? But that is our attachment need. We need to feel our leader is there for us. And so that question is there for all of us. And if we feel like our leader doesn't get us, isn't there for us, doesn't have our back, we're not going to be able to work to or perform to our best, and we're not going to last in that job more than likely. So to break that cycle, when there's a negative cycle happening, and in some of my other webinars, I've spelled out and shown a diagram for the negative cycle. I'm not going to do that today, but to break that negative cycle that we get caught up into, to break out of that disconnect, the first step is nearly always awareness, recognizing there is a disconnect, recognizing something has happened, I've been triggered, okay? Slowing down and identifying the negative cycle, and we teach you the skills. Creating safety, validating the other person's emotional experience, being AORE, accessible, responsive, and engaged. That creates the safety, allows people then to go into the softer emotions so that you're now communicating at a deeper level rather than just having the fight up at the surface, okay? And that helps people to reconnect and engage and often bond more strongly than they might have even been bonded before, which then allows them to go back and be a high performing team. In fact, Google did a massive survey a few years back about what was it that high performing teams had in common. Was it IQ, for example? Was it technical skills? What was it? It was psychological safety. They had a connection. They felt safe with each other. And then it's like the floor under your feet. Once that is solid, then off you go. You can dance to your heart's content. But if the floor is wobbly, then the whole team struggles. Okay. So really what EMC offers is we train people in the language. Let me show you the reconnection that we train people to be able to do is a very structured format. And that creates a lot of safety because it doesn't matter what the situation is. It's like the answer's right here. We're just following this. You don't have to, again, when we're firing off from our emotional brain, our logical brain is not going to be able to think of what should I do next? What step comes next? It's all there in front of you. It's a very safe way of dealing with emotions in the workplace. So this is just the model for our positive cycle when you can repair. So I tune into my experience, and that little exercise that we did today can help you to do that. I share with the other person the impact that the fact that we're feeling triggered, that I think we're in a negative cycle. There's no blame, there's no finger pointing because it's something that's happening in the space between us. When you, as my leader or my colleague, can accept that and validate my experience and reassure, then we create safety. And likewise, then I do that for you. I validate, I accept, and I reassure. So I'm showing I'm accessible and responsive and engaged, and that creates safety. So disconnects are going to happen. They're going to happen in pretty much all our relationships at different times. It's not that's dangerous. It's how we respond to them. Um, if we can acknowledge them and validate and reassure and help get the person back to safety, that gets the relationship back to safety, and off we go about our daily business. But when that doesn't happen, as it so rarely does, we get stuck in a negative cycle that just becomes like a rut, and it gets deeper and deeper. And you often end up with very strong conflict in the workplace. And sometimes that's explicit, and sometimes it's implicit because people are not speaking to each other, they won't work together, they're bitching about each other behind each other's backs, and there's a toxic environment being created. So in EMC, we see emotions really as the music of connection, and sometimes we need to change the music. If you want to, do a tango, you don't put on a waltz. So we can address fear of disconnection with emotional responsiveness, and for leaders, they need to scaffold positive interactions and emotions to foster connection. And if they can foster connection with everybody in their team, and that's going to be different for different folks. So different people will have different needs, and it's getting to know the individuals within your team as well, to meet their emotional needs and be emotionally tuned into them. Then you're going to have your high performing team. So the goal of the EMC process is to provide that common language that I've spoken about and equip teams with the roadmap that I've showed you to relationships. That we teach the steps to repair the connection whenever a disconnect happens, so that you can restore a whole culture of emotional safety, and it increases security in the team so they can thrive. So hopefully, you've all learned something today, maybe about yourself, but also about the people that you work with and about emotions. If you'd like to know more about the EMC approach, I'd recommend Dr. Lola Gershfeld's book. She has several books now published, but that's probably a good place to start. Emotional Connection, the EMC Strategy. Their website is emcleaders.com. It has everything you need to know there. If you go into the resources section, you'll see PDFs, you'll see case studies, infographics, stats, everything you need is there really. If you're interested in this if you're an individual, so if you're self-employed, for example, if you're a coach, a psychologist, a therapist, or a HR person, and you're interested in doing this course yourself, then I'll talk about that in a moment. If you're here and you're part of an organization and you are interested in exploring this a little bit further, then get in touch. If you're in Europe or if you're outside of the States, really contact me. And there's no obligation. I'll have a conversation with you and answer any questions that you might have. So if anybody listening here live today or on YouTube afterwards has any questions coming from this, feel free to just get in touch and we can have a chat. That's no problem at all. So as I mentioned, for individuals, I have a training coming up in October in Ireland, in Portlaoise. It's happening Thursday and Friday, 2nd and 3rd of October. It's 2 full days in person, and it'll be followed up by a half day online about a month later, so in November. And that is the EMC Masterclass certification, which teaches you that reconnection process, so that you can use that either with your clients or with the companies that you work with to resolve conflicts and help people to reconnect where their disconnections are happening. This is a professional training. It is accredited and recognised by the ICF, the International Coaching Federation. It's also recognised here in Ireland by the Psychological Society of Ireland for points, learning points. And when you train with me live, you also receive access to the online training, which is run by Dr. Gershfeld, pre-recorded. You receive access to that for a year. So if you're in the Republic and if you're in a private enterprise, you may be eligible for SkillNet funding. There may or may not be some available. I can't promise at this late stage, but do get in touch if you're interested, because there's not much time now. Do get in touch straight away. And as I mentioned, if you're here for a team or a company or an organization, again, let's have a conversation. Um, so I'm going to finish up there and go to Q&A. If you're not already connected with me on LinkedIn, please do. And we can keep in touch there. And that way you'll see other webinars that are coming up. I usually will do them every second month. If you're not already subscribed to my monthly newsletter, again, there's a QR code for that there. I promise not to bombard you. I do not over email. You will just about get a newsletter from me once a month. Okay. And again, I'll let you know in that about what's coming up. So thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to stop sharing there now and go to Q&A. So today you learned about the three layers of emotions. You learned about how our emotional brain overrides our logical, rational brain. And that's why emotions are so important. And it's so important for leaders to be able to tune in to their employees, their team, and to engage. So it's about slowing down, becoming more aware, engaging, being A or E, accessible, responsive, and engaged. So hopefully there's something there for you today. Thank you so much for joining me. And do get in touch, as I mentioned, either through LinkedIn messaging or you can email me, neve@nevehannon.com. And get in touch if you have any questions. I'm happy to jump on a Zoom call with you. So take care. Have a great day.